Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, crisis management, COVID, well-being, emergency management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. As always, today we're going to talk about one of the subjects I mentioned at the beginning. Today, it's going to be handling communications during a crisis. And I'd like to welcome to the show, Sheena Thomson. Sheena, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you for the invitation. Delighted to be here.
My pleasure. Now, I know we've exchanged some emails and I have some information, but just in case people around the globe aren't familiar with who Sheena is, can you take a minute or two and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into this crazy industry of ours?
Of course. So my name is Sheena Thomson, as you know. I run a crisis and risk consultancy, and we focus very much on the preparation, response and recovery of organizations who are in areas where there is risk that needs to be managed. I spent probably about 11 years, just under 11 years, working overseas, mainly in the Middle East, a little bit in North America, a little bit in Europe. And before that, I was in the corporate sector, all in communications jobs, all in sort of front of house comms jobs. But my main sort of grounding in crisis communications comes from my time in the Royal Navy, where I served initially as a personnel selection officer, but latterly as a media operations officer. And I had a couple of frontline roles, one of which was the NATO S4 spokesperson in Bosnia. I've done a few other spokesperson roles too, so I'm very much front of mind when dealing in a crisis, because I've got quite a bit of experience at the front line, so to speak.
It's funny you mentioned Bosnia. My cousin was actually in the army in Bosnia all those years ago.
Wonderful. Yeah, but it's a multinational force, so there were 40 different nationalities in S4, and I did actually work with mainly Americans and Canadians in the the Coalition Press Information Center in Sarajevo.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be talking about handling communications during a crisis. And the first thing we're going to touch on is stakeholders. What is a stakeholder? Who is a stakeholder?
So a stakeholder is basically anyone who has a stake in the success or failure of an organization. And that can cover a vast plethora of individuals or organizations, but in its crudest form, it's essentially the general public, particularly if you're in the emergency services, or it's an incident or a situation where the public are impacted, employees. It can also mean, if you're in a company, it's your suppliers, it's your clients, it's your investors, it's the emergency services. It's basically anyone that has an involvement in or a stake in an instant event or risk that the company or organization might be faced with.
So how do you manage so many different groups? You just follow one textbook way of doing that, or different groups require different actions?
So there are many different playbooks for different types of situations and scenarios. The most important thing you do when it comes to sort of business continuity, crisis management planning, is you have a plan or a playbook, and each playbook or plan will vary according to the organization and the main line of business that they're in. But the most important thing is that you do that stakeholder analysis as part of your preparation. And quite often what happens is all the stakeholder groups, they'll all have different needs, they'll all have different priorities, they'll all have different interests in the situation. So for example, if it's an organization, say a food production company that's involved in a product recall, for example, obviously the customers need to be communicated. So that's one stakeholder. The retailers need to be communicated. That's another stakeholder. Then you've got the suppliers, you've got the regulatory authority. So you've got a number of stakeholders which will all require segmentation. The messaging, the top line messaging is the same, but then the way in which you deal with them and the after action or the call to action messaging will be obviously a little different.
Do you identify stakeholders before any situation occurs? Because I'm just thinking, if suddenly something happens, wouldn't it take time to get a bunch of people sitting in a room and then going, who are our stakeholders? Wouldn't you kind of have a list, or would you have a list ahead of time to say, okay, in this situation, number 3, number 7, number 9 type thing are our key ones? How would you go about that?
No, you would absolutely do it beforehand, and that would come as part of your crisis management or business continuity planning. And that's where you can really get an edge and get an advantage over a successful outcome versus not doing anything at all. So in an ideal world, you'd have all that identified in a plan. You would exercise that plan on a regular basis, so people would know exactly who they're looking after, where to go for the messaging, what the messaging is, and if they have any statements prepared, which gives you a little bit of time at the beginning that you can then leverage and use. So, but actually when the incident happens, so a plan can only take you so far. A plan won't tell you what decision to make with the facts that are emerging. So what you would then do is, when an incident or a crisis occurs, you would then convene your business continuity team or your crisis management team. You would then review the stakeholders, because contingent on the incident would be who would be looking after which one. So it might be an incident that's really ramping up, but it hasn't hit yet. So there's still an window of opportunity to mitigate that. So then you would take intervention at an early stage to try and, I mean, that's the best outcome, to try and ward off a crisis. But if you can't, then it would be a full review and who's doing what and how you get the messaging, how it gets signed off, etc., etc.
Well, we're going to talk about messaging later on, so I'm not going to ask you any questions about that right now. Depending on the situation, how do you determine who your key stakeholder is? Is it a regulator who's breathing down your neck, the media who's usually breathing down your neck, or the public who's usually breathing down your neck? How do you determine who gets what?
So it very much depends on the type of the incident. So if it's public safety, then absolutely you're dealing with the regulators and the public first off. So again, I go back to the example of food safety. It will be the regulators that will want to know the detail, because obviously there will be a legal process which may or may not kick in. But then the most important thing, as I say, if it comes to public safety or security or anything that's going to be significant in the lives of people, then you would communicate with the general public. And there are several methods to do that. You've already mentioned one, the media. The media are, in the times of a crisis, they can be your best friend or your worst enemy. So my advice is always to engage with them early on, even though you might not have too much to say. You basically need to keep that line of communication open to turn it on when the facts are known, and you do have something more concrete to say once the facts are known.
We're also going to be talking about some of the media a little later too. So during a situation, stakeholders could change, right? As the situation changed. How do you go about managing that when you're trying to manage the situation? It's changing, but also your stakeholders are changing. How do you go about managing that?
So what's important to always bear in mind, at the beginning of a crisis, everyone wants to know everything. There's a real thirst for information, because they don't know if they're going to be impacted or not. They just want to know what it is it true, how does it affect me, what do I need to do? Now, if you get your messaging and your stakeholder analysis right at the very beginning, it's absolutely key that there are some stakeholders which actually won't be too directly impacted. So that then becomes an exercise in communicating reassurance, or just letting them know, no, you're not affected. It's not in your line of products, if it's the product recall or whatever. And at the early stage, that would be then one stakeholder group that you don't have to talk to too much during the incident or the crisis. However, if you don't look after your regulator, for example, then it might become a political issue, because the regulators might be seen to not doing enough to put pressure on the organisation. In which case, then the politicians start to take the heat, and that's when it becomes a bit more of a challenging exercise in terms of crisis communications. So it is a constantly evolving dynamic, which you always have to keep in mind. Again, contingent on the exercise, but the three sort of areas which I always find create more attention when it comes to stakeholder management is any incident that is likely to provoke an emotional reaction, any incident which might make people have a very myopic view, like that's the only thing they're thinking about. So if they're going to lose a lot of money because their shares are tanking because something's happened, or if their own safety is at risk. And I think the coronavirus pandemic was a very good example of that. People just wanted lots of information very quickly.
Is it true that stakeholders can also be internal? The reason I ask is we could have, I know you're in the UK and I'm in Canada, so let's say we work for the same organization. I have an issue over here, but I can still be impacting operations where you are in your office, right? So do we have internal stakeholders as well?
So the definition is any stakeholder is somebody who has a stake in the success or failure of an organization, and that absolutely includes employees. It also includes suppliers and contractors. They often get left out of key communications, but they are exactly de facto an extension of the workforce, if you like. So yes, they do. And where you've got in this very globalized world that we're living in, where you have got colleagues in other countries, if there's an incident in one of their operations in another country, then of course other employees are going to feel that, particularly if it's a grave situation, or it's a fire or something where people are directly impacted. Then yes, you do. If it's mass layoffs, again, you're going to get public sympathy, both internally and externally. In that case, that's when you have to have your internal communication policies very pinned down, so you can give that direct guidance. And classic ones are stay off social media, make sure you don't say anything publicly or speak to journalists. That's another one which often gets forgotten. So it's always a good opportunity to reinforce those policies with your internal stakeholders, and leave the prime communications to the comms department or the comms people that are supporting the crisis management team.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, because there have been instances where a factory or an office is having an impact on the other side of the world, but all of a sudden people in your own office who not even close to what's happening in the UK, as an example, I'm getting a bunch of calls. So, okay, well, someone needs to communicate with me because I'm getting, and you mentioned it, suppliers and everybody calling me, so I'm a stakeholder in this too, but I'm not really impacted by the actual situation going on.
Well, you are, because you're getting calls. So that's
sorry,
why,
I meant not directly impacted.
Yes,
like
I understand, but somebody in an office in Canada who is directly impacted by an incident that's happening in India or wherever, whether it's flooding or whatever. Yes, they are. And a classic example, I was sitting in a corporate office in Edinburgh, and it was the morning of 9/11, and I got a call from the press saying, have you got an office in the World Trade Center? And I said, oh, I don't think so. Why? He goes, just turn on the television. And that's how I knew about 9/11. So yes, absolutely, you do need to be aware of things going on around the world if you have offices or colleagues or suppliers around the world. And the most effective way to do that is to have it covered in your plan. And when the plan is activated, you think, right, okay, we've got offices everywhere. We'll just send a note to all staff saying this has happened, there's limited information, we'll update you regularly, and depending how the plan is or resourced, then there should be country representatives that are taking information. This happened all the time when I was in the Navy, when I worked at a fleet headquarters job, where we had incidents on the other side of the world, attracting a lot of attention in various countries, and military attaches and the embassies around the world were getting calls. So I then had to make sure I had the information from headquarters level that was then being cascaded down for information so they could field local media calls. So that's another example of how it might work.
And I guess to add to that, that's also when you reiterate some of the policies that you should and shouldn't do. Don't post things, on social media. Don't talk to the media. Direct everyone to XYZ person, whoever that may be. Those kind of things get reiterated too.
Yes, and also it's an opportunity to, if you need your staff or employees to reinforce a message that you're putting out. For example, I'll keep going back to the product recall, all our products are safe. So there's also an opportunity to reassure or use internal communication methods to reinforce the message that you're trying to put out externally. Because obviously people still have conversations. You can't stop people having conversations.
Yeah. On that, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking today with Sheena Thomson about handling communications during a disaster, and we'll be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.